Good morning. It's good to see everyone here. So I'll just say quickly sort of what I do. I'm going to start by telling a little bit of my story of how I ended up becoming a Christian after coming out as gay a few years earlier, just to kind of give you an idea of sort of where I'm coming from. And then I'm going to try to spend a good portion of the time on what I learned from my experiences in gay communities and what the churches can learn from that, and then also what the churches have to offer to gay communities. A lot of which was totally surprising to me when I became Christian. It turns out, as you'll see, that the initial period of conversion actually is the easy part, and everything that happens after that is much more complicated. So my background, I was raised in a mostly secular, progressive home with some Jewish religious education, but primarily secular, in Washington, D.C., so I grew up there, and had not really encountered much in the way of Christian witness really until college. But so, excuse me, in probably middle school. What are you when you're 13? You're in middle school. Fairly early, I began to realize that as my peers were starting to talk about their feelings for boys and sort of the plans and the future and the weird, crazy imaginings that they had about boys, that I had no real interest in all that stuff. But as they talked about it, I started to realize that perhaps some of the intense draw that I felt toward girls in my class actually sounded more like what they were talking about. This kind of crystallized for me when I stole a book from my sister, my older sister, who had this series of detective novels where the protagonist, the narrator, is a lesbian. And so we're inside her head, and she's describing a woman that she has a crush on. And I'm reading, I'm like, this is really weirdly familiar. And sort of had this click moment of like, oh, she's describing the same thing that I have felt for that girl in my English class. So this would have been in the early 90s. And because I was in such a progressive environment, my family had gay friends, it was, I think, fairly normal for me to come out to them and to tell them that I thought I was gay. And they reacted really well. It was clearly a challenge for them, but they were very accepting. They tried very hard to make sure that I had whatever support I needed. There was a group called the Sexual Minority Youth Action Assistance League in DC at the time that my father would drive me to so that I could go to meetings and meet other LGBT queer youth. So that was really great. In high school, my best friend and I started the Gay Straight Alliance at our school. I dated a couple girls, one very seriously, and then went away to college, sort of pretty confident in who I was and figuring that I would continue to do gay activism. I remember they made us fill out a form, actually, at the beginning of freshman year of college, of what do you expect to spend a lot of your extracurricular time on here. And I remember I did put gay activism as one of the things. Instead, I ended up meeting a group of philosophical debaters, slightly different set of people, which included people from a really wide range of beliefs. There was a guy who was in the process of becoming an Orthodox Jew. There were a lot of atheists of various stripes. And there were a lot of Christians, mostly Catholic, who were the first people that I had run across who wanted to present the gospel to me in terms that I could sort of understand and relate to. So I spent a lot of that first year kind of listening to them, listening to everyone argue about the most important things in their lives, and becoming increasingly distressed that what the Christians were saying was the most interesting stuff to me, and that I wanted to know more and more about where they were coming from. I took a class, spring semester of freshman year, on the history of Christian doctrine. And again, like, much to my dismay, right, whenever we would have these sort of arguments, we were supposed to pick one side or the other, I would find myself consistently thinking the Catholic side made the most sense. So I had this kind of slow progression of which at a certain point began to actually feel a lot like falling in love. A lot like that early experience that had led to my coming out, of saying, wait, no, my attraction and relationship to the bride of Christ is not what I was expecting it would be. So at this point, I didn't know any other gay Christians of any kind. I didn't know of any gay Christians of any kind, but I'm like, at this point, 20, and obviously thought I was capable of doing absolutely anything, even if no one had ever done it before. So I was like, oh, excellent, this will be great. So I started catechism class my sophomore year of college, went through all that, became Christian at Easter of my sophomore year. And as I said, that's when everything got really complicated. It turns out that for a long time, I made a lot of mistakes in trying to live out my faith. Actually, let me back up and talk about specifically the gay thing in terms of my conversion. I forgot to do that. I had a lot of questions and a lot of things that were keeping me from conversion, as much as I was really drawn to especially the narrative that my friends were giving me of the meaning of the crucifixion and of Jesus in the Eucharist. As much as those things spoke to really deep longings in my heart for justice, for mercy, and for a kind of ecstatic union with God, even so, there was a lot that I found really incomprehensible and troubling in the Catholic faith. And one of the big things was issues around sexuality, mostly but not exclusively homosexuality, because that was what I sort of knew more about. So I asked people, so I should say, the friends who first presented the gospel to me did not ever raise this issue themselves that I remember. They knew that I was gay, they knew that that was really important to me, and they had varying degrees of personal comfort with that. But to them, they talked about what was most important to them in terms of the life and death of Jesus and the mission of Jesus. They did not try to guess what would be most important to me, and I think kind of assumed that none of it would be all that important to me, so they might as well just talk about what they cared about, which actually turned out to be by far the best way to do witness. And it meant that as I began to have my own questions and brought my questions to them, their answers were of varying degrees of helpful, but I could feel with all of them, these people did not set themselves up as experts on my life. They didn't come to me and say, like, here, I really need you to know what Jesus wants you to do about dating. They let me bring that to them, and so it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't necessarily be the most this is not something that they know a lot about. So I talked to them and got a range of answers. I talked to a priest. Let me throw in my sad little story about this priest. He's a really great guy. But when I asked him this sort of, on my part, creepy hedging little question of like, what if I have a friend who wants to know about homosexuality? And he started talking, and the line that I remember that really stood out to me, he was trying to make a sort of natural law type of argument, but doing it in a sort of crude way. And the line that stands out to me was, it's like, so if two women are trying to have sex, it's like trying to open a door when the doorknob is wrapped in barbed wire. I'm sort of like, well, so what I'm looking at, I'm like, one, like, no, it's not. And also, how do you know? Where is this knowledge coming from? So that was not helpful. But at the same time, as much as the answers that I was getting, even the ones that were much better than that, the answers that I was getting specifically on the subject of homosexuality were really unsatisfying. But that didn't stop the other thing that was happening, which was an increasing longing for the Eucharist especially, which would require membership in the church. So as much as I had all these intellectual questions, qualms about things that I knew would be very important to me later in life, at this point, you can't help the other stuff that's going on. So I reached this sort of crossroads where I found myself asking, well, which thing, and this is an overly intellectual way to look at it, but this is where I was at the time. Which thing are you more sure of? That gay sex is morally neutral, so you can go on and have girlfriends and do all the stuff that you wanted to do. Or are you more sure that the Catholic Church is trustworthy on the issues where it claims to be trustworthy, so on faith and morals? And much to my surprise, I was more sure of the second thing. I was, for whatever reason, and part of the reason I don't do a ton of sort of like why you should be Christian is that I'm not sure how people get to that point of placing their trust in the church. But I was at a point where, again, sort of behind my own back, I had reached a point where I trusted the church to that degree. So I became Catholic my sophomore year. I sort of did my best to live out the church's teaching to the extent that I understood it for quite some time. And so the Catholic Church, I should bracket, everything I'm saying is going to be coming from Catholic context and also an American context. And I apologize if any of this turns out to be just like irrelevant to you guys. I don't really pretend to know what the rest of the world does. Where was I? Oh, right. So the Catholic Church's teaching is pretty simple. It's basically that sex outside of marriage between one man and one woman is not within God's plan for us. The Catechism explicitly says that the Church does not have an opinion on why people are I'm trying to remember the language they use, the origin of homosexuality or some weird thing like that. Why people are gay, basically. The Church has no particular theory on that as a matter of doctrine. And the Catechism also says that unjust discrimination against people with same-sex attraction is to be avoided, although in their infinite wisdom, they don't actually tell you what that means. So that's kind of the basics of Catholic teaching, that there's an area of sexuality and marital relationship that is only available to opposite-sex pairs. But then they don't kind of tell you much more about that. And in the broader, again, at least within America and the Catholic Church, in the broader context that I was in, I really only heard priests and other Catholic leaders kind of talking about things in those terms of, here's what you're not allowed to do. Here's the list of activities that are banned. And not a lot about what does that mean for your life, sort of how are you actually supposed to live. At the time, that didn't really bother me. I figured I would just sort of like plunge ahead and everything would go great. And some things went great. But as time went on, I began to feel more and more that that I really needed models, that I needed some guidance or sort of positive form of life that I could, in which I could kind of give and receive love. That guidance is where I think our churches have fallen down the most, in the huge wide range of ways that the church has messed up witness to gay people. I think the lack of a model for a loving and fruitful life is probably the biggest problem, the biggest absence. Let's see if there's anything else I need to do in that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And then my whole project, ever since I started thinking about this stuff in those terms, was to find those positive paths that people who, for whatever reason, are not called to marriage or to religious life, like being a priest or a nun or a monk. What are the different paths of life that we can follow, ways that we can walk with Christ? So that's going to be probably the bulk of both today and a good chunk of tomorrow as well. It's just going to be talking about how much there really is in Scripture and in Christian history that offers models for people whose life paths don't actually follow the ways that the broader culture kind of holds up as normal for Christians. So after I did so in 2015, I wrote this book, Gay and Catholic, Accepting My Sexuality, Finding Community, Living My Faith, which, if you're interested in any of these issues, I go into this stuff more in depth there. The thing is that if you write a book like this, after you write it, lots and lots of people will come to you to tell you about their experiences being gay and Catholic, or being in some other sexual minority within some other Christian church. And so that's actually, you'll find that the book is pretty optimistic and sunny because my own experiences within the Catholic Church have been mostly great. But after the book came out, I got to meet like a much wider range of people who had had a much wider range of very bad experiences. So I do want to spend some time today just sort of talking about like when people come to you as adults who are openly gay, who were raised in a Christian church, lots of the time they're carrying a lot of baggage that I never had to deal with, and that's coming from sort of the church community in which they were raised. I think kind of, so here a depressing list of ways that Christian ministry has harmed gay and same-sex attracted people in the past. I think one of the biggest ones is the approach of suspicion, the kind of unwillingness to believe the accounts that gay or same-sex attracted people are giving of our own experience. That's almost universal in the churches that hold to a traditional Christian sexual ethic, and makes it very hard to make, oh, thank you, thanks. Makes it very hard to make any kind of progress because you're not listening to the people who know the most about what they need. So one way that this plays out is that if people do find ways that are fruitful for them to give and receive love, oftentimes the only way that those life paths will be assessed is in terms of, do they present an occasion of sin, or do they present temptation to sin? So for example, if you say, you know, I've always had a really strong need for women's love, for intimacy and deep connection to other women. And now, fortunately, I have a great relationship with a woman who is my best friend, who I take care of, who really fulfills a lot of that. Very often, there's going to be, I've found, people have experienced a great deal of suspicion coming from their priests or their pastors about whether that's a relationship that's tempting for them, that's sexually tempting. And the thing is, it actually to me, it matters not that much what the answer to that question is. It does matter some. You have to be aware of what the sources of temptation are in your life. But to have that be the only question, as opposed to also asking, what are the temptations to sin if you don't have that relationship in your life? What are the temptations of sin if you're alone all the time? Which offers temptations to lust, among many others. What are the temptations if you don't have someone you can be honest with? What are the temptations if you feel that there is nowhere for you to give all the love that you have inside yourself? Those questions are not asked because they don't fit into the model of gay and same-sex attracted people as sort of inherently lustful, our sexuality almost defined as lust, and therefore anything that we do that seems to have some hint of same-sex attraction in it becomes also tainted and suspected. That I think is really spiritually devastating for a lot of people and pushes them away from the paths that God may be calling them to. It makes people afraid to form deep bonds with others, especially others of the same sex, which is, in my opinion, an almost universal human need, is same-sex bonds. Let's see. It's decreasing now, I think, but there's still a pretty big ideology that people choose to be gay. And that therefore, especially for younger people, that their same-sex attraction is a sign of willfulness or rebellion. Again, I don't know to what extent this is cross-cultural, but at least in the US, I think this fuels a lot of the rejection of gay teenagers by Christian families, that they see this as a rebellion against the parents. What's sort of interesting in a certain sense is that it kind of doesn't matter what your own beliefs are, your own actions. I've met people who are following the historic Christian teaching on sexuality, who have never had gay sex in their lives, have no plans to, have no desire to, but who know that they are same-sex attracted, and when they came out to their parents were rejected or even kicked out. Right. So, and again, because the mere sort of acceptance of one's identity is seen as threatening and willfully rebellious. So that's another thing that, again, like I don't know how often you'll run into people in these situations, but it's something that I've seen a certain amount of that really colors a huge amount of how gay people view the church as adults. And sort of related to that, gay people are often treated as almost like a symbol of social ills. So in preaching and things like that, you'll hear a kind of opposition set up between Christians and the gay movement, or the homosexual rights movement, which, if you're a teenager who's starting to realize that the feelings that you have for another guy in your class may actually fit this model, it's almost like you have to say, wait, what if I'm one of the enemies? Which again is like, it's very hard to kind of understand how that could be true and why God would make you against your will one of the enemies of the church. But as I indicated earlier, I really do think the biggest thing that the churches do that's harmful is silence on fruitful and loving paths and futures for the gay people in the church. Andrew Sullivan has this great passage, really heartbreaking, from one of his books. He's a gay Catholic writer who disagrees with and doesn't follow church teaching. He's married to a man. I've met him, he's a great guy. But he has this passage in one of his books where he's saying that in a lifetime of going to Sunday Mass and listening to the homilies, which is more than I can say I've done to the homilies, he has never heard, not once, has never heard a priest address the question of how someone who is same-sex attracted ought to live their lives. That where his future should be, there was just this blank desert. That, I think, is the thing that more than anything else convinces people that either the church must be wrong or that God doesn't love them. And I've met a lot of people who grew up in the church, who are faithful, who, again, have never wanted a gay marriage, have never pursued gay sex, who, have tried to be good kids. And who later in life come to realize that this whole time their image of God has been deeply warped by growing up in an anti-gay church. That the image of God that they had was not of a father who loved and cherished them, but someone who looked on them with mistrust, with suspicion, with dismay, with judgment. So that, I think, that's the deepest thing that goes wrong, is when people's image of who God is warped by their experiences growing up in the church. So, what am I looking at? So, on the other side of the equation, so people see, part of where you're often going to find people coming from is that they've had these really bad experiences in the church. And the other thing you're going to find is that they've had really good experiences in gay communities and gay relationships. Whether they're gay or not, they've often seen a lot of goodness in the gay relationships around them. And the huge mistake that so many Christians make is to say that that's not real love or that those things aren't really good, which to me is crazy. And no one believes it. It's not even sort of false but effective. So let me talk about what I gained from my own experiences in gay communities and my current experiences in gay communities as well, and in the relationships, the gay relationships that I've either participated in or seen. One is just the obvious devotion and care between partners. When you see people, when I was in high school and going to those sexual minority youth meetings, I heard a very young guy talk about nursing his lover through the last stages of AIDS. It's hard not to see that as love and devotion, especially, again, in someone so young. I saw people who were helping each other survive in very desperate situations where they were struggling with serious poverty, with discrimination, and they stuck together. And I also saw the gay community coming together as a community to support people, as a community under attack, and a community that was, again, at that time going through some of the worst years of the AIDS epidemic, but also beyond that, many other forms of violence and discrimination. And that really bonded people together. It made people come together in solidarity and in friendship. I began to learn there the incredible importance, which you'll hear a lot more of in the rest of this, of your chosen family, of the friends who become kin to you and take care of you, often for gay people when your own biological family has rejected you. And yet, there is this other family that you can find as an adult that will shelter you, guide you, and make sacrifices for your good. If this sounds like the church, right, this is what the church should be. And yet the place where I saw it most, certainly growing up, was in gay communities. Where am I? Yeah, so seeing people serve and sacrifice for one another, seeing people choose to stand with those who are marginalized and discriminated against, which again, should be a mark of the Christian church, but was more visible in gay communities. And seeing people who had, like me, I grew up wealthy, I'm white, I had a lot of markers of privilege, and seeing other people in that situation choose to stand with those who had less privilege and choose to see themselves as essentially in a relationship to gay people who were black or poor or had other things, who were not able to escape some of the discrimination of being gay in the way that I could if I wanted to. Seeing that choice to stand with those who were in a more oppressed and marginalized situation was also really powerful for me. So these are all things that the churches can learn from gay communities and gay relationships about what it means to love another person and what it means to love a community, to love the world, really, to go out and spread the good news. What then does the church have to offer to gay communities, to gay people? Well, obviously, redemption and forgiveness of sins, but there's also other things that we may not realize as we witness to people that we have to offer that the rest of the world is not offering. One is a much broader understanding of what it means to be family. Right now, almost the only models of family that we have, again, this is speaking from an American context, are parent and child relationships, and then spouses, marriage or romance. There's my favorite example of this. Did any of you guys see the Pixar movie, Inside Out? Okay, do you remember before that, there's a little cartoon about a volcano. And the volcano, right, is all alone in the middle of the ocean, and he's surrounded by couples. There's two little turtles that walk on him actually. There's two fish that jump in the sea. There's two seagulls that fly above him, and he is all alone. Which, by the way, is not how fish and seagulls and turtles work. There's no school of fish. There's no children. There's no little seagull chicks. It's just couples, and then this one lone volcano who sings every day about how he needs somebody to lava. And so then nobody ever comes. And so he is in despair, and he sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And it's like a fairly chilling sort of suicide metaphor, I think, right? He sinks to the bottom of the ocean, his fire goes out, but way far in the depths of the ocean, a lady volcano who has heard his song rises up from the depths, essentially rescues him by the power of her love, and they are now together as a heterosexual rock formation. And I have to say, this is kind of the image of adult life that, in my experience, most Americans, and certainly most American Christians aspire to. That you find your soulmate, and again, of whatever sex, right? Doesn't have to be a lady volcano, but you find the one person who you can form a romantic union with, and that is the solution to your loneliness, to the terrifying problem of who will care for me. The same day that I saw Lava, that I saw Inside Out, the US Supreme Court gay marriage ruling came down, in which there's this very powerful passage describing the purposes of marriage and saying that one of the things that it is most intended to do is to answer the question of, when I cry out in the night, who will come to me? That is a question that, as far as I can tell, American society has mostly decided to answer by saying, you should get married. And so to exclude gay people from that means excluding them from the system that we have created to answer people's loneliness and despair, and to give them kin. This is in many different respects not the Christian way. The Christian way, first of all, has a much greater honor for solitude and for celibacy, for the gift of one's body solely to God, making your body a sort of secret garden for God's pleasure alone. That is something that dates back. It was a huge rupture with the Jewish way, but is present in Jesus' own life, that he himself died a virgin, had no biological children, despite what Dan Brown may tell you. And continues, and you can see it in Paul's letters, and it continues to be a huge driving force in Christian spirituality, depending on what church you're in, up to the modern day, where we have an honored place for the celibate priesthood or for monks, nuns. If you're an Orthodox Christian, your bishops are all going to be celibate. And these are people who have, in a special way, set themselves apart in a way that is honored, that is not a sign of lack, but of a kind of fullness of the enjoyment of God, an undistracted enjoyment of God. I want to call this out for a few reasons. One is that I always forget it. My whole project is about getting people to have social ties and distractions and people to love and people to pour themselves out for other than God. So I have to kind of remember, actually, no, there's a huge place in Scripture and in Christian history for people who sought to minimize their bonds to others, who saw that as liberation and freedom to serve God alone. But also because it helps us to think about the purposes of our bodies. That when we give our bodies to others, every time we love, we have to love in and with the body. But the model that we've been given for doing that is primarily, I think, marriage and parenting. If neither of those are going to be a part of your life, I think you need to think hard about how is it that I worship God with my body, and how do I serve others with my body? Whether that's in the physical practices of worship, like kneeling, like spending hours in prayer, which parents often wish they could do, or whether it's, especially for you guys as doctors, thinking about the very physical work of serving those who are in intense physical need, who may vomit on you at any moment, that's a way of really humbly serving God with your bodies and in your bodies, and therefore a way of accepting your bodies as good, as gifts of God. So that's one thing that Christianity offers that the outside world does not recognize, the goodness of celibacy and the possibility of solitude as fullness and not emptiness. The other thing, though, that we can offer is a much broader range of family models. This goes back as far as the Old Testament. We see David and Jonathan forming a covenant of friendship in which they pledge to sacrifice for one another in service to God, and become part of one another's families. This, again, in the New Testament, there's a couple other things we could talk about in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, this model of friendship as family becomes much more heightened and intense. Jesus says, "Greater love has no man than this, to lay down his life for his friends," which is a line that we've heard so often that we kind of don't notice how weird it sounds, that if you were to ask a person on the street, what is the greatest form of love? I think a lot of people would say, well, the love of a mother for a child, or your love for your spouse, or your love for your own mother. But, it would take a long time of going down this list of who can people love before you reach your friend. And yet when Jesus reaches for a model to teach us what God's love for us is and how we should love God ourselves, his first choice to jump to is friendship as a model. This is partly because Jesus identifies both friendship and family with discipleship. He says, "Who are my mother and my brothers? They are the people who hear my words and do them." This obviously includes his actual mother, the Virgin Mary, sort of famously does what God tells her. But it expands beyond that and creates a family of church, in which the church becomes the family that sacrifices for one another in a profound and ongoing way, in the same way that we would expect to serve our families, to perform our obligations to them, and to be cared for by them in turn. That actually, Jesus is saying, don't necessarily expect that from your families. I have not come to bring peace to your families, but I have come to give you a new family in the church that is not bound by blood, but, well, I guess by his blood, really, that is bound by faith. That is something that could be exceptionally and especially powerful in gay communities, again, because of the rejection that many people have experienced from their parents, and also because many gay people have had the experience of finding that chosen family, those friends who are like kin to them because of love, and because of the obligations that they perceive as members of the gay community to one another. If they saw that same thing being poured out on them from their churches, that I think would transform both the churches and gay communities, as well as obviously their relationship to one another. So that's the scriptural picture, and I think it should be startling how far that is from what we see in many of our churches today. Not all, but many, and especially if you're gay. Throughout Christian history, there have been lots of models for how to live that in different cultural contexts. So it doesn't stop right when Scripture stops. There continue to be models of the church as family, of intentional communities forming, as well as obviously parishes being family, but too, you could have other communities in the monastery, or even for lay people. As far back as the late Middle Ages, you had women, lay women, forming non-monastic communities to live together, to share their economic resources, and to serve the poor in their local communities. Several, if I'm recalling correctly, several of the first hospitals actually are founded by these groups of Christian lay women. And interestingly, after the Protestant Reformation, many of these communities tried to kind of bridge that divide by taking in both Catholic and Protestant women, which was, I'm not sure I can think of other Christian institutions at the time that were doing that. In terms of friends as kin, friends as family, there's in both Eastern and Western Christianity, up until pretty late, there are practices of public friendship where friends would make various kinds of vows to one another, sometimes just very practical. People would agree to, two heads of household would agree to share their finances and their food. But often very spiritual. People would say, okay, well, my best friend and I will be godfather to one another's children, and we'll unite our families spiritually in that way. And whichever one of us dies first, the other one will make sure to pray for him and to have masses said for him. And again, this is much like marriage in that it is both a very practical arrangement, but one with real spiritual consequences, and often one where there was real deep love. If you read some of the descriptions of the emotional ties between people who made these bonds of friendship or covenants of friendship, it often does include the kinds of tender feelings that we would associate with best friendship today. That lasted in the West up through about the early modern era, so I think you could still get away with it, like the generation after Shakespeare. By the time, there's a book called The Friend by Alan Bray, which goes through the history of all this stuff. If you're interested in this, it's a great place to look. And the last figure, the latest figure that he talks about as someone who attempted to have as close to a public friendship as you could in the England of his day was Cardinal Newman in the late 19th century. Cardinal Newman is buried with his best friend, and Bray basically says, yeah, he was pretty much the last Englishman who was able to get away with that. These friendships now have no public power, right? If you are in the hospital and unconscious, nobody's gonna call your friend. The hospital is not gonna say, okay, well, your friend obviously should be the one making decisions about your care. If you are trying to figure out who you make your life with, it takes a while before you realize, wait, actually I could share a household and make a life with my best friend. I could actually, live with the children I am godparent to. Maybe that would be helpful. But for centuries, for over a millennium, this was the one normal out of many, one normal way to live as a Christian. In the East, some of these practices actually lasted longer. There's an article in First Things from the mid-90s about a woman a history professor, who traveled through, I think, Syria. Where was she? Somewhere in the East. And a priest asked her, oh, is this woman that you're traveling with your sister? And she said, no, she's my best friend. And the priest says, do you want her to be your sister? And performs a rite that he was quite familiar with, that would make them spiritual kin to one another. So she was actually able to have this kind of public friendship like David and Jonathan, millennia later. But for us here now, it's very hard to find ways to have the same clear marking of obligation and care. That, I think, if I were to come up with like a project for churches to have, I think reviving spiritual friendship and friendship as a public form of kinship would be one of the greatest things that they could do for their own witness and to be more like the early church. So this is obviously something I'm passionate about and could talk about forever. But let me throw out two final things, and then I'll go to, I want to leave a good chunk of time for Q&A for you guys. When you start as a church throwing your doors open and saying, we welcome everyone, we want to meet everyone, people may take you seriously. And then things get really weird, right? Because people come who are living in, the Catholic jargon is often irregular situations. People who are in ongoing situations that in terms of the Christian sexual ethic are immoral. Jesus himself was super familiar with this issue. And the interesting thing is he does two things with people in irregular situations. One is that he is more welcoming to them than the outside world. We know this, right, from the story of the woman caught in adultery. But he's also more stringent in terms of his sexual ethic. He restricts or bans divorce, which was much more stringent than the marital practices of the time. And he also expands the concept of what even is adultery, what counts as adultery. If you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you have committed adultery. So he's actually making the sexual ethic stricter within the church than outside it. And yet the practice of defending people who are harmed because of their sexual immorality is present from the beginning. The idea that the church is a place where you are safe. Where you will not be made to feel ashamed, even for your sins, and where you will be welcomed, especially when others have attacked you for your sins. So trying to keep both of those practices kind of hand in hand. I think many churches do pretty well with one or the other, but it's very rare to find a church where you can find the same unstinting welcome, unstinting, in fact, like defense of people in situations of sexual immorality, but at the same time, a reminder that the actual sexual ethic of the church is even stricter than what the outside world proposes. There are a few things that you gain if you do this. One is obviously solidarity with those who are in powerless or humiliated positions. After the shooting at the nightclub in Orlando, a lot of Christian churches actually came out to show solidarity with gay communities, some of them, and also a synagogue in DC, an Orthodox synagogue, I believe, sent their members to a gay club, basically to say, like, we stand with you, and if people come to attack you, we want to be there. My church and many other churches in DC participated in a vigil, a candlelight vigil for the victims of the shooting. Which again is one like fairly powerful way that you can show that you want not only to proclaim a kind of general welcome, but to take risks and to willingly stand with people who are under attack. And then the other thing that you gain is what? Is something that I've totally forgotten, so we'll skip it. You also, well, I will say you also make people feel a little more safe that they can come to you. Oh, I remember what it was. Okay, so first, you do make people feel that if you are willing to sacrifice for them and their communities, they will be more honest with you and more willing to share more and more of their lives with the church. But the other thing that you gain if you uphold the Christian sexual ethic as opposed to whatever portions of the Christian sexual ethic are acceptable to the culture around you, you do gain from the fact that it's super hard for everybody, that trying to live as a faithful Catholic spouse is often life-shapingly hard. It is in itself a cross. In the Eastern churches, when a couple is married, they're crowned. There are crowns that are placed on their heads. These are the crowns of martyrdom, actually. That, I think, sends a very strong message, right, about what you should expect. And the thing is that if people are actually trying to live this out, they'll find that that's true. For Catholics, a place where you see this constantly is in the choice not to use contraception. That is a genuinely major sacrifice, both in terms of one's physical well-being and difficulties in the marriage and economic choices, huge economic sacrifices. But there's lots of other ways in which Christians who are actually following the sexual discipline of their church take risks that are not honored by the culture. And so being able to share solidarity in that with people who are taking other and different risks is pretty huge. I volunteer at a crisis pregnancy center in DC. And it's been great for me for a lot of reasons, but one is just that you're able to be both honest about the difficulties of being celibate. At the same time, you get to see how super hard it is if you are a straight person trying to live out the Christian sexual ethic. A lot of the women that we see are Christians in a culture that does not respect the sacrifices that they make for their faith at all. And so seeing that specifically within the context of heterosexuality is really powerful. The final thing that I want to point out is that there are a lot of idols. Every culture has its own idols. I would argue that marriage is one of our culture's idols. Idols are usually good things, right, that have taken on a distorted position. So like Apollo, right, is the god of poetry. Poetry is good, but Apollo is a false god. And similarly, I think marriage is a good that our culture has, again, speaking from my own context, placed in a distorted position where it is almost the only vocation that anyone aspires to as a Christian. Morality is another idol. It is good to do good, but to take morality as the goal of the Christian life is a huge distortion, and one that has severely damaged Christian witness to gay people. That we're approached as if the central question of our lives is, what's your moral life? And even within that, what's your sex life? That's not the only relevant question, right? The question from which any other question has to start and flow is, what is your relationship with Jesus? And then the third idol is choice, the idol of control. This is one that you'll often see in Christian churches that are, for whatever reasons of their own, dissenting from the historical Christian sexual ethic. They'll often say, well, it's okay if you choose to be celibate. It may be unhealthy or creepy or sort of perverse, but sure, right? We accept all kinds of alternative lifestyles. But to me, one of the central truths that you find when you look at both scripture and Christian history is how little we choose our vocations, how little power we have over what God is calling us to do. Many of us do have some areas of choice, but often in the areas of love that turn out to be most life-shaping, we're only given the choice that Mary was given, of do you say yes or no? Reviving that understanding for everyone, including those who are in more privileged positions, makes it much more intelligible how the church could propose such a difficult path for people in marginalized positions. If we are all accepting powerlessness together, that makes a huge difference as versus a world in which heterosexuals get to do more or less what they choose, and gay people get to be celibate. Dethroning the idol of choice, I guess would be my third sort of like prescription for churches. All right, as usual, I've ended in a super weird place, but let me throw out to you, I think we have a good amount of time for questions. I want to say ask absolutely anything. It will probably not be the weirdest thing I've heard. And if it is, that's good. Now I have a new standard. And I'll try to be clear about where my answers are coming from, if it's just my personal opinion, or if it's the doctrine of the Catholic Church, or if it's from having listened to a lot of gay people and other people in other similar positions in the church.